Hi. So what I'm going to read to you now is a translation from the Japanese made by my dear friend Keiko Ichigawa of a letter that her cousin in Japan received earlier this year. Now, you might have read about this online or in the papers. Anyway, I have Keiko's permission to read it to you tonight in English and in full. So, dear Madam, I hope that you will forgive a letter from a stranger. What I'm about to write may shock you, but I'm determined to make my confession. I have committed strange and dreadful crimes. For many months, I've hidden myself away from the eyes of man, hidden like the devil himself. In this whole wide world, no one knows of my deeds. Now, this must sound perplexing to you, and perhaps you think me mad, but I beseech you, madam, bear with me and read this letter to its end, because only then will you fully understand the strange workings of my mind and the reason why it is to you and you alone that I must confess. I hardly know where to begin. My tale is so far detached from everyday life, so utterly fantastical, that it feels absurd to chronicle it with such mundane tools as pen and paper. But I will try to lay bare the events in order, just as they happened. First, you must know that I am ugly beyond description. My face is repulsive to look at, and so is my body. And my appearance has been made all the more repugnant by my many recent months of unsanitary living. Please remember this, madam, because otherwise I fear that if and when you grant me my ultimate request, you may recoil in disgust at the sight of me. But, madam, I implore you to believe me when I state that despite my physical ugliness, within my heart there burns a pure and overwhelming passion. I'm a humble workman by trade. Had I been born into a well-to-do family, I might have found some way to ease the torture of my soul brought on by my bestial countenance. Or perhaps if I'd been endowed by nature with literary talents, I might have been able to seek consolation in poetry. But unblessed with such gifts, and being born to poor and humble parents, I had no trade to turn to save that practiced by my unhappy dead father. I became a specialist in making chairs. Now, I was successful in this line of work, and I gained over time a good reputation. I became known as one who was able to satisfy any kind of order, no matter how challenging and elaborate. And gradually, I came to enjoy the privilege of accepting only orders for luxury chairs. I fulfilled many elaborate and complicated commissions, unique carvings on arms and legs, novel designs for backrests, fancy padding for cushions and seats. It was work that called for skilled hands, a steady eye, and a patient mind. And my chairs far surpassed anything which the amateur craftsman could produce. I mean, it was tiring and physically demanding, and it was not lucrative, but the reward for my pains lay, initially at any rate, in the sheer delight of making. I mean, you may call me a braggart, madam, but on completion of a chair, I experienced, or so it seemed to me, the same kind of thrill, the same sense of achievement, the same pride that the true artist feels upon completing a masterpiece. And as soon as a new piece was ready, it was my custom to sit on it to see how it felt. And despite my dismal lot in life, at these moments, I used to experience a singular, indescribable thrill. I'd allow my buttocks to make themselves at home in the upholstery, and then I'd close my eyes and I'd imagine the happy, wealthy folks who would eventually curl up in my chair. I pictured noble men and women living in palaces and mansions, priceless paintings on the walls, expensive rugs on the floor, fragrant Western flowers scenting the air. And you see, lost in these reveries, I came to feel that I too belonged in such dwellings. And I derived endless pleasure from imagining myself as an influential figure in society, a man of power and charisma and influence. Oh, madam, what a pathetic, contemptible figure I cut. I picture it, this hideous prole, me, wriggling alone in a luxurious chair of my own making, pretending that I was fondling the hands of some invisible darling, smiling as she hearkened to my every word, her pretty little dimpled cheeks and a smooth young skin, and then the chuntering of the neighbourhood slatterns outside, and then the shrieking of their brats would waft up from the sleep, and my dreams would shatter. Reality would rear its ugly head, and I would find myself slammed back down to earth, a wretched, crawling worm, and my beloved angelic dream woman, poof, vanished like a mist. Oh, madam, I knew what a fool I was, because not even the filthy streetwalkers looked my way when I went out. And one day, having completed a new chair, as good as any that I ever made, I sat down in it, and rather than being elated and stimulated to fantasy, I found myself instead weighed down by greater feelings of shame and despair than I'd ever felt before. And as the months passed, my long accumulated self-disgust began to choke me. One day, however, I was charged with making a leather-covered armchair for a foreign hotel in Yokohama. It was to be very large and of a type that I'd never tried before. Now, originally, the management had planned to import a chair from abroad, but my employer had talked up my skill, and I was given the commission. I mean, it was highly prestigious, and I applied myself with great seriousness to the job. In fact, soon I became so engrossed in the construction of this chair that I began to skip meals, even sleep, to work on it. It would be no exaggeration, I think, to say that in a short space of time, that job became my life. Every fibre of the wood that I used seemed to be linked to my heart and soul. And when at last that chair was completed, I experienced a satisfaction more intense than any that I'd known before. I dragged it into a sunny spot on the porch of my workshop, and as of old, I lowered my bottom into it. I let the legs take my weight, and oh, the comfort, the luxury. I was neither too hard nor too soft. The springs seemed to match the cushion with uncanny precision. And as for the leather, the feel of that beneath my fingers and against my cheek. This chair, madam, did not simply support me, it seemed to embrace me, to hug me. I noted the perfect reclining angle of the back support, the delicate puffy swelling of the armrest, the perfect symmetry. I let my body sink deeply into it, and caressing the two armrests with my hands, I gasped from sheer pleasure. And then, oh dear, you see, then once more, my imagination began to play its tricks. The strangest fancies frolicked across my mind, and one scene in particular rose before my eyes so vividly for a moment that I asked myself whether I were not going insane. An idea had leaped into my head, which could only have been set in motion by the devil himself. And I recognized at once how sinister it was, and yet it attracted me so powerful. I couldn't cast it aside. At first, no doubt, the notion rose from my secretly yearning to keep this chair for myself. But realizing, of course, at once that was out of the question, I next longed to accompany the chair wherever it went. And slowly but steadily, as I continued to nurse this fantasy, my mind fell into the grip of a horrible temptation. And, madam, I succumbed. Oh, I succumbed to the temptation. I made up my mind to carry out my awful scheme to the end, come what may. God, imagine, madam, coming to a decision like that. Quickly, I took the armchair apart and I reassembled it for my weird purposes. As I've said, it was an unusually large chair. The seat extended right down to the level of the floor. The backrest and arm supports were of matching dimensions, and I soon contrived to make within it a cavity large enough to accommodate and entirely conceal a small man. Now, of course, some remodeling had to be done. The woodwork within needed to be streamlined and some of the springs removed. But you see, the chair was of my own design. I knew it like I knew my own body. And soon I'd arranged it that my knees could be placed below the seat and my arms within the arms, while my torso and head fitted inside the backrest. And seated thus in that cavity, I was completely concealed. Now, manic with invention, I added a few extra touches. I improved acoustics to catch outside noises, and of course a peephole cut into the leather that was quite unnoticeable to the naked eye from the outside. I also supplied storage space for provisions, a few boxes of dried biscuits and a water bottle. For another of nature's needs, I inserted a large rubber bag. And by the time that I'd finished fitting out the chair with these facilities, it had become, all right, not comfortable perhaps, but habitable, for stretches of 2 or 3 days at any rate. Completing my weird task, I stripped down to my waist and I became one with my creation. And oh, madam, it felt strange. So strange. It was as if I buried myself alive in a lonely grave. And on reflection, it struck me that it was a grave indeed. Because as soon as I entered the chair, I was swallowed up by complete darkness, and to everyone else in the world, I was no more. Presently, a messenger arrived from the hotel with a large handcart to take delivery of the armchair. I saw him talking to my apprentice, and as they and 2 other men lifted the chair onto the cart, one of them cried out, "Good God, this weighs a ton!" And my heart leapt into my mouth. But you see, I had pre-warned the dealer of the chair's great weight, and so no serious suspicions were aroused. Before long, I could feel the judder and hear the rattle of the handcart being pulled along the streets. And at length, that same afternoon, the armchair and I were placed down with a thud inside the grand lobby of that beautiful hotel. Now, as I'm sure you've already guessed, my key motive in this venture was theft. I planned to leave my lair when the coast was clear, prowl around the hotel and start stealing things, because who would ever dream that a thief was hiding inside a chair? Like a fleeting shadow, I could ransack every room at will. And by the time any alarm was sounded, I'd be back inside my sanctuary, safe and sound, and holding my breath. Or more likely, sniggering, snorting as I watch the buffoons outside running around looking for me, rushing up and down a few inches from my face. Possibly, madam, you've heard of the hermit crab. Yeah, like a great sea spider, this marvelous crustacean creeps around the seabed, and as soon as it hears footstep, it scuttles back into an empty shell, from which hiding place, with gruesome hairy legs partly exposed, it looks furtively about. Well, I was just like that freakish crab, except, you see, I had a greater hiding place than the shell. I had a chair. A chair which would conceal my entire body. And I'm sure you can imagine my adventure in burglary was a complete success. I acquired much valuable treasure, but this is not the place to describe that. Rather, madam, allow me to proceed with my narrative and tell you of a far greater source of weird joy, which I soon discovered. In fact, what I'm to relate now is the key point of this whole letter. Is it as soon as the chair was put down inside the lobby, various members of staff at the hotel took turns testing it out. But you see, the manager soon put a stop to that, and it was some time before anyone used the chair for its proper purpose. Now, this was a very tense time for me, waiting there for the adventure to begin, and I fell to imagining all manner of ways in which I might be discovered, and the shame that would bring with it. But then, after what seemed like ages, I heard heavy footsteps drawing near from the direction of the corridor, and very shortly afterwards, the sound of a man panting. He was all out of breath. And then, before I could brace myself in any way, boof! A large, heavy body dropped onto my knees and seemed to bounce 2 or 3 times before settling down. And it was a fat man. It was a big, fat European man. And with just a thin layer of leather between the seat of his trousers and my knees, I could feel the warmth of his body. His broad, muscular shoulders rested flatly against my chest, and his thick arms lay heavily over mine. A strong aroma of cigar smoke came floating into my nostrils, and occasionally his whole body was convulsed by a cough, and again he'd bounce up and down upon me. Several other people sat on me that day, but none of them suspected, even for a fleeting moment, that the soft cushion on which they were sitting was actually human flesh, with blood circulating in its veins, confined in a strange world of darkness. Oh, what was it about this mystic hole that enthralled me so? I felt like an animal living in an entirely new world, the first of my breed. And as for those other animals, the people who lived on the outside, they were simply now, to me, disembodied noises. Their heavy breathing, the rustling of their clothes, their sighs and breakings of wind. But gradually, I began to distinguish them also by the sense of touch. So as they sat on me, the fatties felt like large jellyfish, while those who were especially thin made me think that I was supporting a skeleton. And I began then to appreciate the great range of human bodies, the seemingly infinity of variations, the different curves of the spine, the breadth of shoulder blades, the length of arms, the thickness of thighs, and the contours, and forgive me, madam, of the buttocks. And you see, I developed also new insights into women. In the daylit outside world, women are classified broadly into two categories, the plain and the beautiful. But you see, to me, in the dark, confined world of the chair, facial merits or demerits were of no significance at all. Far more meaningful qualities to me were found in the feel of the flesh, the sound of the voice, and the odor of the body. Continue with my narration. There was one girl, one of the first who ever sat on me, in fact, who kindled in my heart a passionate love. I mean, judging by her voice, she was a European, and at the moment that she entered the lobby, her heart must have been filled with joy because she was singing to herself in the sweetest voice. Soon I heard her standing immediately in front of my chair, and without any warning, she suddenly burst out laughing. The next moment, I could hear her flapping her arms in the air like a fish struggling in a net, and then, pop, down she went, sat on me. For about 30 minutes, she sat on me, continuing to sing and moving her body and feet in tempo with her melody. God, what an experience. I mean, my ugliness had always denied me any meaningful proximity to women in the past, but now I found myself virtually skin to skin with a European girl whose face I couldn't even see. Entirely unaware of my presence, she continued to act with unreserved freedom on the chair, and inside I visualized. Oh, madam. It is wrong of me to write of this to you. Anyway, following this unhallowed but undeniably enjoyable experience, I forgot all about my original intentions of committing robbery, and I plunged headlong instead into a whirlpool of sensory pleasure. Sitting all day with my arms and my knees bent, of course, I got very, very stiff. And over time, my muscles became so taut and inflexible that I found that I could only crawl instead of walking to the washroom, which, of course, I only ever did in the middle of the night and then with the utmost caution. But you see, even in the face of this great discomfort, I could not persuade myself now to abandon my new delight. Even now. As I bring back to my mind all my love affairs, I can recall the delightful variety of the female form. Some of the women possessed firm bodies like ponies. Others seemed to have the slimy bodies of snakes. Still others had bodies composed of nothing but fat, giving them the bounce of a rubber ball. And there were some unusual exceptions who seemed to have bodies made of nothing but muscle. They're like Greek statues. But you see, notwithstanding the species or the types, one and all of them had a special magnetic allure, quite distinctive from the others. And I was perpetually shifting the object of my passions. Now, in the hotel, although there were a few long-term guests who stayed for a month or two, there was always a constant flow in and out of different people, and I could never manage to enjoy a permanent love. At one time, an internationally famous dancer came to stay, much to the excitement of the staff. Now, she sat on my chair only once, but the contact of her smooth, soft flesh against my own, it afforded me a hitherto unknown thrill, because on this occasion, instead of my carnal instincts being aroused, I simply felt like a gifted artist. being caressed by the magic wand of a fairy. Strange, eerie episodes followed in rapid succession. But as space prohibits it, madam, I shall refrain from giving a detailed description of each and every case. Instead, I will continue to outline the general course of events. One day, just several months after my arrival at the hotel, there occurred an unexpected change in the shape of my destiny. For some reason, the proprietor of the hotel, who was a foreigner, was forced to leave for his homeland, and the management was transferred to Japanese hands. Now, this change in proprietorship precipitated a new policy, namely a drastic retrenchment in expenditure. And one of the first results of this was that the management put all the extravagant furnishings in the lobby up for auction, including my chair. I was deeply disappointed when I first heard about this. But you see, soon a voice inside me advised to return to the natural world outside, spend the tidy sum that I'd acquired by stealing. I'd no longer have to return to my humble life as a craftsman, because I was by now comparatively wealthy. And this promise of a new role in society overcame my disappointment in having to leave the hotel. And also, you see, when I reflected honestly on the pleasures which I had derived there, I was forced to admit that, although my love affairs had been many, there'd always been something lacking. The fact is that they'd all been with foreign hotel guests. And I realized then that as a Japanese, what I craved was a lover of my own kind. Now, while I was turning around these thoughts in my mind, my chair and I were sent to a furniture store to be sold at an auction. Now, maybe this time, I told myself, the chair will be purchased by a Japanese and kept in a Japanese home. And so, with fingers crossed, I decided that I would be patient and to continue with my existence in the chair a while longer. For 2 or 3 days, I suffered greatly while the chair stood in the furniture store, never once being able to creep out. But eventually it came up for sale and was promptly purchased by a high-ranking official who lived in Tokyo. Now, when I was being transferred from the furniture store to this man's residence, so the bouncing and the vibrating of the delivery van almost killed me. But I gritted my teeth, I bore up, and comforted by the thought that at last I was being introduced to a real Japanese home. Inside the house, I was placed in a spacious Western-style study, and I found, greatly to my satisfaction, that my chair was meant more for the use of his young and attractive wife than for him. And within a month, I had come to be with this lady constantly. With the exception of sleeping and dining hours, her soft body was almost always seated on my knees. She was artistic, you see, and engaged then in much reading and study. And the love that I developed for this creative, intellectual lady. She was the first Japanese woman with whom I had ever come into close contact. And she possessed a wonderfully appealing body. She seemed like the answer to all my prayers. Compared with this, my other affairs in the hotel, they seemed like childish flirtations. I just longed to hold her every moment of the time. When she was away, even for a fleeting moment, I waited her return like a love-crazed Romeo yearning for his Juliet. Such feelings as I never hitherto experienced. And gradually, I came to, I needed to convey my feelings to her somehow. But How could I do that? I mean, if I revealed myself, the shock of the discovery would immediately prompt her to call her husband and the servants, and that, of course, would be fatal to me because exposure would not mean only disgrace, but severe punishment for the crimes that I'd committed. I therefore decided upon another course of action, namely to add in every way to her comfort and thus awaken in her a natural love for the chair. I mean, she was herself an artist, and I felt confident that her natural love of beauty would bring us together. I mean, and as for myself, I was content for her to love an inanimate object because I could find solace in the belief that her delicate feelings of love for even a mere chair were powerful enough to penetrate to the creature that dwelt inside. In every way, I endeavored to make her more comfortable. You know, whenever she became tired from sitting long in one position, I'd ever so gently just move my knees and embrace her more warmly, making her more snug. When she dozed off to sleep, I'd rock her ever so softly into a deeper slumber. And somehow, I mean, possibly by a miracle, or maybe it was just my imagination, this lady did seem to fall in love with the chair. Like every time she sat down now, she acted like a baby falling to a mother's embrace, or a girl surrendering herself into the arms of her lover. And when she moved herself about in the chair, I felt that it was with an almost amorous joy. And in this way, the fire of my love and passion rose into a leaping flame that could not be extinguished. And I finally reached a stage where I simply had to make a strange, bold plea. Ultimately, I began to feel that if she would just look at me, even for a brief passing moment, then I could die happy. No doubt, madam, by this time you have guessed who the object of my passion is. Ever since your husband bought the chair, which I hope you're sitting in when you read this, I've been suffering excruciating pains because of my love for you. I am but a worm, a loathsome creature, and have only one request. Can you meet with me? Just once. I will ask nothing further of you. And of course, I know I don't deserve your sympathy. And I've never been anything but a villain, unworthy to touch the soles of your feet. But if you will grant me this one request, just out of compassion, my gratitude will be eternal. Last night, I stole out of the chair to write this confession, because even leaving aside the danger, I did not possess the courage to meet you suddenly face to face without any warning or preparation. But don't worry, I'm not in the chair now. No, while you're reading this letter, I will be roaming about your house with bated breath. If you will agree to my request, madam, just place your handkerchief on that pot of flowers outside the entrance to the study. At that signal, I will open the door and enter as a humble visitor. I love you.